2022 has seen its fair share of horror films, and there are still several high-profile releases to come. I decided to watch one a day, excluding those I had already seen, to try to catch up with all this year's genre fare. Each week I'll be doing a brief review of each film I've watched, and whether or not I'd recommend them. The first release of the year was The Legend of La Llorona on January 7th. It's based on the legend of the eponymous ghost, first recorded in the mid-16th century. In the original myth, a native woman had a child with a Spanish colonizer, but when he abandoned her, she was driven mad and murdered their offspring. There are commonalities in different versions of the myth, especially constant weeping, drowning the children and herself, and a white dress. All of these are featured in the film. Autumn Reeser and Antonio Cupo star as an American couple who have traveled to Mexico for a vacation after a miscarriage. They bring along their young son, but they immediately encounter issues with some bad guys who are members of the cartel, and the ghost of La Llorona appears to harass them and tries to take away the child. Danny Trejo appears as the guide and later savior as he runs around blasting the ghost with a shotgun. The set design is fairly solid, and they're able to highlight the nice old mansion they filmed at. The acting from Reeser is also fairly good, although the same can't be said of the others, especially the child actor for Danny. It's not the kid's fault. There's very little to work with, given the dialogue and the direction, but it's definitely noticeable. The ending of the film is decent, with a small island in the middle of a swamp with dolls holding children's souls all around. Unfortunately, the film has a huge number of issues. The most noticeable is the effects, which are just awful. There are 4 or 5 times where I laughed aloud at the blood or smoke, and almost all of it is CG. The budget is felt tremendously here, and this is a big problem, as the villain is supposed to be a spooky ghost meant to inspire fear, but the Spirit Halloween costume just brings about chuckles. There are other cases where the budget is obviously felt, with some extremely dark scenes and other extremely obvious day for night. There is also a whole subplot with the cartel men who harass the family, and in the end their leader is Danny Trejo's son, but it could really be cut out of the movie and nothing lost. There's also a lot of clunky exposition early on, and a few things that are set up that don't come to much, like a song they put a lot of emphasis on in the first act, but then it's promptly forgotten about. The husband/boyfriend character is also extremely annoying and acts like every machismo asshole in one. Overly aggressive, dismissive, disbelieving, and talking about how others would have left his partner. There's no real redemption arc either. He doesn't change throughout the film, and in the end when he lives it doesn't mean anything. Also bizarrely, he says frick instead of fuck, even not in his kid's presence, which is a baffling choice. Overall the film is cliched, it doesn't have any good effects or kills to make up for it. There's a little bit of joy to be had from Danny Trejo running around and trying to shoot a ghost, but it's a small percentage of the screen time compared to the generic haunt story that makes up the rest of the film. This one's not recommended. Premiering on January 22nd was You Won't Be Alone. It's about as far from the previous film as could be. The basic plot is that a burned witch woman arrives to eat a child. The mother begs her for mercy and offers the girl on her 16th birthday. The witch leaves, and the mother hides her child away in a cave, returning twice daily to offer food and water. Sure enough, 16 years later, the witch claims her prize, but frees the girl, allowing her to explore the world and the people in it. Despite there being shape-shifting witches who steal organs to take on someone's appearance, this is not a horror film. It could be considered genre, but there is no attempt to scare or offer tension. There's no real antagonist aside from humanity as a whole, and any violence is incidental to the story. It's a supernatural coming-of-age drama, and it excels at that. The main character, named Nevena, is given the powers of the old witch. That means she can kill someone, take their guts, and become them. This allows her to experience humanity through all views of life. There are a few vignettes of her, showing the perspective of a mother, then a farmer boy, then a little girl. She sees the way people mistreat each other, but also how they help her. She is mute due to her upbringing, but is still able to communicate and even fall in love. It's a very intimate film, and this is shown especially in the filmmaking style. A huge amount of the shots are close-up, on people and things. Dialogue is spare, but effective, and much of the storytelling is communicated visually. In many ways, it's a homely film with a lot of warmth and compassion. There's not much in the way of plot, as it is just a girl experiencing life for the first time, but as long as you anticipate this, it works. The effects are all fairly seamless, and the kills are not dwelled upon, but leave a lasting impression. Overall, there is this serious and somber air to it, communicating that people do awful things to each other, especially with the backing of a community, but also that life is worth living. That hopeful spark elevates the film, whereas a more nihilistic interpretation would have been draining. It's very much an old-school fairy tale, and it works. If you're looking for something like The Witch, or another period horror film, this will disappoint you. But going in expecting a more artful, touching work, and you'll find something very special. Recommended, but requires the right mood. Hellblazers was also released on January 22nd on Tubi. It stars Billy Zane and allegedly Tony Todd, but really they paid him for a day's shooting in about 3 scenes. In it, a small town, and I mean small, is assaulted by an army of cultists who summon a demon. In film, there is a basic setup for ideas. Introduce them, reinforce them, and then pay off them. It's used so much that most of the time it's subconscious. This film has got the first part, and sometimes the second, but really is missing that payoff. An example. The main character, Joshua, is moved into this town from the big city, a fact repeated in every single interaction he has with other characters. In an early scene, he references Cujo as they're talking about rabid animals, but the others don't recognize it. Later, he references the cultists looking like Michael Myers. That line doesn't make sense, and Ghostface would have been more appropriate, but I digress. Again, the small town character doesn't get it. Another character allegedly, we never see it, runs a video store and talks about killer clowns from outer space. That character dies before Joshua can meet up with him, where the references would have been appreciated. They were so close to building something up and paying it off, but he just isn't there. There's so many parts of the film like that. Setups that don't work, characters that appear and disappear, and repetition. In the opening scene, there's a lead cultist performing a ritual to summon a demon. An old Vietnam vet called Bill witnesses this from the bushes. There's some attempted comedy here that doesn't work, which is unfortunately continued throughout. Bill has the only funny lines and is unfortunately killed off half an hour in. After this scene, the leader disappears from the film and only shows up in a mid-credit scene, which feels extremely cheap. Bill then goes to the sheriff's office and recounts the entire event to him, completely, with a few pauses for quips. This is a whole 5-minute explanation of what the audience has already seen, and either his retelling or the original scene needs to be cut. The cultists here are basically video game bad guys with how they appear and die. About 20 of them are killed throughout the film, and they never say or do anything special, just run at characters with melee weapons and fall into obvious traps. There is also a demon who appears periodically to murder people, and the effects are actually fairly decent on it. That's definitely where the care went, as the others range from mediocre to decent, although they needed a lot more fake blood on set to amp up the ridiculousness. It's not expensive, and someone tossing a bucket of corn syrup can really add to the feel this film was going for. It's probably set in the 80s or 90s, as there are no cell phones or other modern technology. This was probably an attempt to recreate the horror films of the day, but unfortunately the writing just isn't there. Schlock takes a special kind of care and attention, and this film feels like a first draft, filled with half-baked ideas. 2 or 3 rewrites and this could be a decent picture, but with what was made, it's just not. This is not recommended. Also, there's an after-credit scene as well, which is just ridiculous. Films should have 0 scenes after the credits, especially ones that add to the plot, and this one had 2. The Long Night, or The Coven, came out on the 2nd of February. It shares many similarities to Hellblazers, as a murderous cult is trying to summon a demonic entity. In this case, however, it's not a town of 6 people, but a woman and her boyfriend, who arrive at an isolated farmhouse. After a few spooky goings-on, strange people show up with torches and prevent them from leaving. This film is effectively The Strangers, but with superpowers and much, much less interesting. The cultists for some reason can both teleport, as they appear in rooms they would have no way to physically get into, and the lead one literally has the Force, holding people up with telekinesis and breaking their bones. There are a couple of predictable twists at the end of the film, but it takes far too long to get there. There's also another annoying boyfriend character. I don't know what it is about horror, but not only did he allow his parents to bully her, saying that's just what they do, he also complains about absolutely everything in the house they go to. The main character, Grace, is looking to find her family, and he can't even act a little bit enthused. There's also the big city versus rural south dynamic when another character arrives, and it's just the most tiresome thing. The newest Texas Chainsaw Massacre also did this, but There's another video I made about that particular horror show. Ultimately, this film does have some atmosphere and a few decent scares, but the tension is deflated because of how long it takes to get going and the vague powers. Regardless of what entity you're dealing with, there needs to be restrictions, or at least something outlining what they can do, but the cultists just have supernatural abilities. That, combined with standing around menacingly for an hour, removes the fear. It's far from the worst film, but it doesn't offer anything unique or appealing to justify a watch. Studio 666, on the other hand, released on February 16th, has at least a few more interesting things going on. It's the Foo Fighters film, where the band is going through creative withdrawals and abscond to his haunted house. The leader of the band, Dave Grohl, is possessed by demonic forces and begins to act strange and obsessive in his attempt to finish their 10th album. The actual members of the group star, and it's extremely obvious at times they're not actors. Still, Grohl gives a fairly solid, if over-the-top performance. This backed up by extremely solid gore effects and a good variety of flair for the kills. It's a horror comedy, and in many cases it works, but the lines that fall flat do stand out. I'm not personally a fan of the band, but I imagine it has a lot of Easter eggs and references to their work. It's got a bit of a slow second act, and the escalation could have gone a bit further, but it still offers an 80s-style demon flick with a bit of unique flair. It's worth a watch, even if just for the effects. No Exit was released on February 25th. It's a bottle film set in a visitor lodge during a snowstorm. Recovering drug addict Darby, played by Havana Liu, is trying to get home to her mom who is in the hospital, although her family doesn't want her there due to previous incidents. After getting stuck in bad weather, she discovers a kidnapped little girl in the back of a van and has to figure out who among the 4 other inhabitants of the building is involved. In many ways, it reminds me of Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, the isolated cabin, distrust, and dialogue-heavy focus. The tension is definitely highest when the group play a game of bullshit, and the creepy Lars takes the game a bit too far. It's the best scene of the film, and highlights exactly what they were trying to do with the remainder. Unfortunately, once the kidnappers are revealed, this dies down a fair amount, and though there are twists, it never reaches the height of this early scene. Still, it's well acted, well shot, and has good effects, including a particularly gnarly scene involving a nail, which is always a fun time. The ending is suitably satisfactory, and although not everything fully comes together, it's still worth a watch on a wintry afternoon. X, coming out on March 13th, is a film that I don't really need to talk about. It exploded in popularity and already has a sequel due out this month. It's a slickly made slasher with some well-implemented themes. It's not the greatest film ever, but with an extremely clever script, solid acting including a dual role by Mia Goth, and tasteful references to its horror ancestors, it's a well-done stew. The plot is that a small group heads out into an isolated house in mid-Texas to film a porno. The owners of the property, the elderly Pearl and Howard, have some disagreements with them, and eventually some strange things start to occur. It's a simple plot and has been done hundreds of times before, but what makes the difference is the themes discussed. Some more common including the price of fame and the American dream, but more touching and rare are the discussions about the fear of growing old and past sexual maturity. There's also some subversion about the final girl, as the character who seems to be set up as the survivor character is killed off unceremoniously. Much of the violence in the film is brutal and shown in full, including some very skillfully done comparisons between the film the characters are making and what's happening to them. The Dead Meat podcast has one of the best examinations of the film, but there are already a number of solid essays about it, which can go far more in depth than this brief review. Either way, it's a thumbs up from me. So that was the first week of films. There were some really solid efforts in there, and a couple stinkers. My favorite film was No Exit, the best was You Won't Be Alone, and the worst was The Long Night. I hope you've enjoyed these rapid reviews. I'll have another video each week until the end of the